Well, dear colleagues, dear compañeros, dear visitors, thank you for being with us this Saturday afternoon, and many, many thanks to good old friend, academician, activist, intellectual, Yanis Varoufakis. Very briefly, Yanis is a graduate of mathematics from University of Birmingham and then University of Essex. He had taught at Essex, East Anglia, Cambridge universities in 1987. He was fed up with the Thatcher government, if I may say so, Yanis, in your shoes. He moved to Australia to teach at the University of Sydney, and then he came back to Athens. He published many contributions on game theory, especially his The Global Miniature is a prime. In 2015, he was the Minister of Finance. He fought against the European Troika. In 2016, he launched the Democracy in Europe movement, and since then, you know the rest of the story. Today, Yanis is with us. He started his paper with this sentence that economic theory is aimed at analyzing the workings of capitalism. However, capitalism has been morphed into something else that he calls Technofeudalism. Yanis, we are so happy and proud and privileged to have you on board. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. The privilege and the pleasure is all mine. To begin with, because we are not far away. I'm in Athens. You are, I'm not sure where you are. You're in Ankara, in Istanbul. But anyway, you are close enough. I think that it is crucial during these tense times in the Eastern Mediterranean for us to be talking. I want to send a big hug and an embrace to all our friends in Turkey. It is essential that progressive people in Greece, in Turkey, in the whole region, that we bind forces together in order to make the Eastern Mediterranean the cradle of prosperity, of sustainability, of peace, of cooperation. I think this is important to note. And, you know, I feel really good addressing a Turkish audience today. Thank you for the invitation. Okay, let's start with a couple of things that you mentioned regarding my understanding of the world we live in. Firstly, the role of economics, the role of economic theory in capitalism. And secondly, the hypothesis that I'm putting forward, and thank you for mentioning it, that since the great crisis of 2008, the great financial collapse of Western banking systems all over the place, we no longer have capitalism. Capitalism has already morphed into something else, which is techno-feudalism. And that brings me nicely to the third part that I want to discuss. What does this mean for economics? What does the transformation of capitalism to something that I consider quite distinct mean for economics, economic students, economic professors, economic theory, economic discourse? Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. The relationship between economics and capitalism. What is the relationship between economics and capitalism? I mean, historically, economics emerged because of capitalism. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was no need for economics. If you wanted to understand why the Spanish became quite rich at the expense of Latin America, you didn't need economics. If you wanted to know why the Spanish Navy was very powerful in the Atlantic and why they built an empire, you really didn't need economics. You needed some economic concepts, and you needed economic history, but you did not need economic theory. You need to know about naval technologies. Why was it that it was the Spaniards that managed to build big ships and sail to Latin America, and not the Incas coming to Europe instead? You need to understand, you know, how they plundered Latin America for gold, how they transported workers to Latin America, how later on other European powers transported African slaves. You don't need economics for that. History will do quite nicely. But if you want to understand why the American car industry died and American streets were populated by Japanese cars, history won't help you there. You need to have some economic concepts. So Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations because chaos was what the people of Britain were experiencing during the Industrial Revolution. They could see out there and they didn't recognize the world they lived in. And there was no way politics or religion or moral philosophy could enlighten them as to what was going on. So the Wealth of Nations, with concepts like division of labor, like the effect of competition in pushing prices down and causing innovation later on and so on, that was an essential narrative. So economics developed because of capitalism. But the great irony is that by the time it moved to universities, by the time it became a professionalized academic discipline, not something that a moral philosopher like Adam Smith, a banker and landlord like David Ricardo, a revolutionary like Karl Marx, a politician like John Stuart Mill did in their spare time to understand the world. That's what political economy was before it was professionalized, before it moved into the universities, into the departments, and became a discipline. And we had economics departments. That transition shifted the whole approach to capitalism of the classical political economists to a neoclassical physics-like mathematical modeling exercise, where the truth of capitalism was sought in systems of equations. And that's where economics became very successful, because of the discursive power that economists acquired through having very complicated mathematical models, and then they hooked those up to statistical models, econometric models, and suddenly we appear to the world as scientists, like the physicists or the chemists. But where is the irony? The irony is that in order to solve our own mathematical models, we have to make assumptions that essentially made our economics absolutely irrelevant to capitalism. So let me give you a very simple example of that. The moment you have the demand and supply curves, you do away with time. Time cannot coexist with the demand curve and the supply curve. You remember that from year one, semester one, what you learn at university, but very soon we forget that, is that the demand curve is a relationship between prices and quantities, all other things being equal. Now, the only way all other things can be equal is if there is no time. What some people do, which is, they shift the demand curve and they say, okay, so we go from this equilibrium to that equilibrium, from one point of intersection to another point of intersection, because the demand curve has changed. And therefore, the price will go up. That's a mistake. That is completely unsustainable by the theory, because the theory cannot tell you what will happen over time. What the theory can do is it can give you a hypothetical. If there was no time, therefore, ceteris paribus applied. And if we, instead of having this demand and that supply curve, we had another demand and another supply curve, then the price would be different. It would be that one, not this one. But that's not the same as saying that when the demand curve shifts up, then the price will go up. That you cannot say. Anybody who teaches economics in that way is lying, is going against the very assumptions of the theory. So to cut a long story short, there can be no time in economic theory. The moment you introduce time, your models cannot be solved. Take general equilibrium theorems like, Arrow-Debré. They are incompatible with time. So the moment you introduce a little bit of time, the whole thing breaks down. It's not like physics, because in physics, also physicists make simplifying assumptions. They say, okay, let's imagine there's a world without gravity, without dust, without any imperfections, without resistance. And you try to find out some basic equations of motion, linking the mass of a body, its acceleration, its velocity, the force that you apply on that body in order to have the velocity and acceleration. And you end up with a really very nice little equation, okay? Very simple. And then you can introduce impurities like, resistance, like dust, like gravity, and so on. And the equation more or less resembles the original one, but it gets more complicated. Right? But in economics, the moment you introduce one speck of dust into the equation, one tiny little bit of time, the whole thing collapses. It is impossible to retain it. So, this is the irony. To become successful, for us to be professors of economics and have a salary in an economics department, we had to mathematize economic theory, go from classical to neoclassical. But by so doing, we made ourselves irrelevant to the study of capitalism, because capitalism without time is impossible. The only reason why capitalism works is because there is time. There is no, take for instance the interest rate. What's the interest rate if you don't have time? So models that have interest rates in them are hypocritical, because you're assuming, if you think of it as a price, sure, just like the price of apples, the price of money, that's what the interest rate is. But can you imagine investment without time? So how can you have a theory of investment if you don't have a model which can actually take time? Anyway, so that's the first point I always wanted to make. It's a really very, I believe that in 100 years, 300 years, 500 years, philosophers of science will be looking back to what we take for granted now as economic science, and will be saying, my goodness, what a strange and weird religion that was. Because it's a religion with equations. We have beautiful equations and a lot of statistics, but it is a religious faith, because the science of it cannot sustain any connection between the modeling and capitalism. Okay, I know it's a very radical position, but I dare anyone to try to disprove it. Show me one economic model that can be solved without imposing assumptions that remove it from the realm of capitalism. Second point, my hypothesis, working hypothesis, that capitalism morphed into something else, which I call Technofeudalism 2008. Now, what do I mean by that? Capitalism is a system, a machinery that survives on the basis of profitability of the profits of the private sector. And then the state can come in and tax and spend and do all sorts of other things. But capitalism per se is private capital accumulation, which, as capital accumulates, transforms into rent payments, interest payments to financiers, and what is left is kept as profits by the capitalist, which is then reinvested in the production process, which through an exploitative, extractive sequence creates more profits, more capital accumulation, which then again is distributed between interest, rent, and profit, and so on and so forth. That's capitalism. Now you can have more competitive capitalism, less competitive, more monopolistic capitalism. When Adam Smith was writing, capitalism was very competitive because firms were very small. None of them had cornered their market. There were no Amazons back then, no Walmarts, right? And profitability was rather low, as Adam Smith was prognosticating and arguing. Then with the second industrial revolution and the networked firm, vertically integrated large companies like Thomas Edison or Henry Ford, and now, as I said, Amazon, Facebook, and so on, you have a lot more power, market power, a lot less competition. But again, up until 2008, you had the engine driving capitalism being private profitability, private capital accumulation, with its tendencies towards stagnation and so on and so forth. After 2008, that is no longer the case. In 2008, for reasons that I don't have time to discuss now, you mentioned, thank you for that, The Global Minotaur is the book in which I try to explain this process. Actually, not this process, what led to the 2008 collapse, which I keep saying is our generation's 1929, in the same way that 1929 changed the world completely and utterly. 2008 has changed our world completely and utterly. But think about it. All the banks, every single bank in Europe and the United States, as well as other banks, but certainly in the United States and Europe, every single bank went bankrupt. You know, it really concentrates the mind to say that. And they were only saved by the central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Switzerland, the Bank of Sweden, the Bank of Japan, printing rivers of money and refloating finance. I don't know whether you noticed, but they never stopped since 2008, because effectively they zombified the banking system and the corporate world. Since 2008, the rise of financial markets, once the financial markets were saved and refloated, is due to the central bank printing presses. And that was the case before the pandemic hit us. And it is a lot more now with the pandemic. But all the pandemic did was to accelerate, to turbocharge, if you want, what was going on before 2008. Now, there are three aspects to this period after 2008. The first one is that the corporate world, the big business in particular, and banks have become hooked, like, addicts. They've become addicted to central bank money. So the force driving the system, the engine pulling, what we know as capitalism, is no longer capital accumulation within the private sector, but it is central bank money. That's the first dimension. As I said, there are three dimensions. Now, the second dimension is that along with the massive use of printing presses of the central banks, what you also have is austerity being practiced almost everywhere. While the central banks have been printing money, giving it to the bankers, who then give it to the companies, the vast majority of the population of Europe and of the United States, and I'm concentrating on the developing world, on the developing countries, the vast majority were subjected to very significant austerity. What is austerity? Spending cuts, reductions in pensions, in wages, in benefits, in expenditure on public education, public health. That has been the case across the developed countries from 2008 onwards. Now, this combination of public money, central bank money, being fed into the financial markets and austerity for everyone else meant one simple thing. And the one simple thing it meant was that the money that was printed by the central banks and given to the private banks was wasted. It was wasted in terms of investment into capital accumulation. I'm not just talking about climate change, of course, or the things that we needed to invest in, but even investment in capital accumulation fell into a crevice. And let me explain why. So, since I'm speaking from a Eurozone member state, I'll use the ECB. I could use any central bank. I could use the Fed, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, whatever. But take the European Central Bank. In order to facilitate some degree of growth, of dynamism in the economy, since 2015, the European Central Bank has been printing money and giving it to the private banks. So, for the purposes of stimulating the European economy, Frankfurt, the ECB, prints, let's say today, 2 billion euros. They pick up the phone and they call Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, one of the large private banks, because they have to, by their charter. Central banks in capitalism have, by their charter, the obligation. They can't lend it to business directly. They cannot lend it to people, to you and me. They have to lend it to private banks. So they pick up the phone and they call Deutsche Bank. Let's stick to that example. ECB calls Deutsche Bank. I've got a few billion. Do you want it? I'll give it to you for negative interest rates. In other words, I'll pay you to take it. Of course they will take it. But of course, banks need to lend the money on, because the nightmare of a banker is to have money that they have not lent, right? The only way a bank can make money is by lending money on. So Deutsche Bank then looks at, German people are there, German businesses, small businesses, or French businesses, or Greek ones, and they look at them and they say, no. These little people out there, little business people, little consumers, if we lend them the money, we will probably lose it, because austerity ensures that their share of income is shrinking. So we're not going to give the money to people whose income share is shrinking. So they don't lend it to small businesses. They do not lend it to people who actually need the money and who would do good stuff with the money. So what does Deutsche Bank do? Picks up the phone and calls Siemens or Alstom, a large conglomerate, or Google for that matter, or Amazon, right? Now, those companies have huge savings. Now, that in itself is a sign that there is something really desperately wrong with the system, because, we used to teach our students that households save and corporations borrow. When corporations save, there is a problem. They should be investing. What's the point of a corporation saving? And the reason why they're saving is because they don't want to invest, because they look like the Deutsche Bank directors. They look at the little people out there and say, Volkswagen thinks, I'm not going to build a German Tesla, because who's going to afford 100,000 euros to buy one? So instead, what they do? They take the money from Deutsche Bank, which it has taken it from the European Central Bank, and they go to the stock exchange, and Volkswagen buy back Volkswagen shares. Volkswagen share goes up, and the salaries and the bonuses of the directors of Volkswagen go up, because they are linked to the share price. But this is not an investment. The money is wasted. It doesn't go into new jobs, into new battery technologies, into the things that we need to do to save the planet. So the financial sector is doing remarkably well. The share prices of the corporations are going up and up and up and up, but profits are zero. Investment is the lowest it has been in the history of capitalism relative to the available money that we have, not you and me, but as a society. And this is a total and unmitigated failure. The pandemic simply turbocharged that, even lower demand, even lower production, even lower investment, and even more money printing, keeping the financial markets. You've noticed, haven't you, that financial markets are, happier today than they have ever been in the history of capitalism, when profitability is zero. So this is what I'm saying. Capitalism, what we now know as capitalism, no longer depends on the private sector or capital accumulation. It relies on central bank money, and financial markets, financialization is completely decoupled from capitalism, from profitability. So that's the second dimension of technofeudalism. Now, the third dimension, the feudal part, consider Amazon, the kind of firm that has emerged most strongly after 2008, and especially after the pandemic, or Facebook. The moment you enter Facebook, you exit capitalism. The moment you enter Amazon.com, you exit capitalism. You enter a digital fiefdom belonging to one man, either Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. It's a bit like, imagine, you're in Istanbul, right? And you leave your apartment and you walk outside, you're in Istiklal, right? And suddenly you realize that, imagine that, this is science fiction. It's a dystopic science fiction. You look at every shop and you think, my God, every single one of those shops belongs to one person. You look at all the things that are being sold, from, bread to clothes. And you think, everything I see and everything that's being sold to me is controlled by one person who decides what I can see and what I can buy and what price I can buy it and how many items I can have. And then you think the air I breathe and the pavement on Istiklal that I'm walking on belongs to the same person. And then suddenly this is why this is a nightmare of a science fiction movie. You think, my goodness, also what I see is determined by that one person. If that one person doesn't want me to see that person, that other person, or that other, that dress or that restaurant, I will not see it. That's not capitalism. It's not even a monopoly. Monopoly means you have, Istiklal, and there's one person selling bread. That's a monopoly. But when everything that you see and everything that you do depends on one person, that's feudalism. And it is techno-feudalism because it is digital. So the combination of the digital applications and platforms that create this feudalism, with the fact that wealth is being created by central banks, the state, not the private sector, to me, tell me that we don't live in capitalism anymore. And, you know, in what do we live? I had to come up with the word. I came up with the word techno-feudalism. Finally, what does this mean for economics? It means that a discipline, an economic modeling, which was irrelevant for capitalism, is doubly irrelevant today. Because, you know, demand, supply, and so on. You know, if you show the demand and supply diagram to Jeff Bezos, he's going to kill himself laughing. This is not how Amazon works. Moreover, and I'll close with this so we can have a conversation. Take the great debate going on in the United States as we speak because of President Biden's unexpected and welcome attempt to go big, to opt for a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus and investment program, which I think is a good thing. But focus for a moment on the debate. Has he overdone it? Is this stimulus and investment package of Joe Biden too big, too large? Is it too small? Is it just right? I'm not going to answer this question because I think this question is wrong. My view is that given the state of techno-feudalism that we live in, it is simultaneously too large and too small. Why am I saying that? We have these two worlds, the financial world and the capitalist world. The world of stock exchanges and derivatives and shares, and the world of actual production, capitalist production. Now, these two worlds, if I'm right in my theory, have decoupled. Once upon a time, we used to think that there is such a thing as an interest rate that can equilibrate both the financial markets and the goods market, the real markets. I don't think such an interest rate exists today. It's not a question of finding it. I don't think it exists. I don't think there is one interest rate that can simultaneously, one price of money, to put it differently, that can simultaneously equilibrate the financial markets and the goods markets, the real markets. If I'm right in that, every level of stimulus is simultaneously too large in the sense that it will start pushing interest rates in financial markets up, which is going to start a cascade of insolvencies of companies that are totally zombified, totally, and simultaneously it's going to be too little because the stimulus, however large it is not going to create the good quality jobs for the reasons that I advocated before, because the stimulus money in the end ends up simply pushing up share prices. So the equilibrium models of economists that were irrelevant before 2008 are now irrelevant at an order of magnitude, which is exponentially larger than it was before 2008. So we need to, we always needed to understand capitalism in a manner that economic theory could not procure, but now that need is more urgent and the task is harder. Thank you.
And it's many thanks for your thought-provoking remarks. Colleagues, I am opening the floor for your questions, comments, anything you would like to intervene and join to the program. The floor is yours. And you can use the chat box or the messenger section of the YouTube, or simply raise your hand and our administrative personnel will direct your